Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
There was a piece in the papers not very long ago by a quite well-known team in America who do neuroimaging, and they're particularly interested in moral values. And they found that by suppressing activity in the right temporoparietal region, they caused a failure to understand the nature of moral judgments. They set up a scenario of Grace hoping to put sugar in her friend's coffee, but actually by mistake putting poison in, and she died. In the other scenario, Grace intended to poison her friend, but put sugar in, and the friend lived. In the normal state, we probably think it was worse to intend to poison, but the good old left hemisphere, on its own, thought in what is basically an autistic way that the outcome was the important measure. But then these neuroscientists, I won't mention their names to spare them their blushes here, finished up by saying, if something as complex as morality has a mechanical explanation, it'll be hard to argue that people have or need a soul. So is the concept of the soul a redundant idea now that science has made us see it as a superstition? Or are we actually turning our backs on something very important simply because we can't satisfy demands for precision and proof? And in fact, are we making a category mistake? Well, so I'm going to ask today two questions. What use is the soul as an idea? And I think I have an answer to that. I think it has a use. And I'm also going to ask, if so, what might the soul be like? And about that, I'm afraid, I am less certain. I expect a lot of us would sympathize with the soldier of Marlborough's before the Battle of Blenheim who was reportedly heard praying, "O God, if there be a God, save my soul if I have a soul." Nowadays, it's become a kind of embarrassment to talk about the soul, and yet until now it has been central to most cultures. The word has disappeared, and language is an aspect of reality. If it's true, as Wittgenstein said, that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language, making something disappear by language could bewitch us into thinking it didn't exist. Let's think in simple terms. Can this word be substituted? Well, it seems to me to place the person in a widest context, a context outside the confines of immediate time and space, and even to involve an idea of destiny. So, for example, Othello's great lines, "It is the cause, my soul, let me not name it to you chaste stars." It would be difficult to replace that with, it is the cause, my mind, my brain, my emotions. It seems that the concept has a meaning, which we can't exactly say what it is, but it, as I say, sets the human being in a broad context, not the narrow context of where we're encountering the person. And it seems to have this idea of a destiny. And so one gets the idea of Keats's, that the world is a veil of soul-making. What did he mean? He didn't mean that we grow up intellectually. He didn't mean that we got better at being moral citizens. He didn't mean that something happened to our heart exactly. He meant something bigger and deeper. So is our sense of the spiritual something like our moral sense? Well, it certainly has something of that, but it goes beyond it, doesn't it? There's a rather marvelous moment in a play of Iris Murdoch's called Above the Gods. The character says, in a way, goodness and truth seem to come out of the depths of the soul. And when we really know something, we feel we've always known it. Yet also, it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. It's like beyond the world, not in the clouds or in heaven, but a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is. But they put me in mind, she was a Platonist, of Plato's speaking of philosophy in the 7th letter. He says, "For philosophy doesn't admit of exposition like other branches of knowledge, but after much converse about the matter and a life live together, suddenly a light, as it were, is kindled in one soul by a flame that leaps to it from another, and thereafter sustains itself. So thinking and moral reasoning are part of it, but what both those passages seem to suggest to me is there is something deeper, more transcendent, over which we have less power. So is it to do with emotion? That's another possible idea, because after all, we say soulful often means with emotion. You could say somebody is unhappy, you could say this is sadness, and in a way that's right, depending on what we mean. The case of depression and so on is not really sadness. Is it perhaps a soul sickness? Psychiatrists, after all, the word means soul doctors, and in German there was the idea that doctors were ministering to die Seele, which is a hard thing to define, but that's the point. We need a word that's hard to define, because if we define it, we'll probably miss the point altogether. Well, let's get a little bit less defined. It could be sort of imagination, something like that. And indeed, again, it often involves imagination, but it surely is other than that and goes beyond it. And there's plenty of imagination which is not in the service of the soul at all. In a book called Logos of the Soul by a follower of Jung called Christou, talking about Jung's idea of the soul, he comments, a person who spent his life in a cell may have enriched and deepened his soul. And this wouldn't mean, moreover, that he spent his time accumulating fantasies or writing learned treatises. It's probably more imaginative in the way that Wordsworth used the idea, become a living soul. There are overlaps there. Okay, it's not any of those things precisely, but could it be a something that stands over against our embodied existence? Well, I think there's two things wrong with that. The one is that it's not a thing, and the other is that it's not over against our embodied existence. Like matter, according to Whitehead and Bergson, the soul seems to me to be process, more process than a thing. We come back to the phrase, a veil of soul making. Perhaps not all souls are equal. Perhaps we have to grow our souls. Perhaps souls can be so thwarted that they're almost extinguished. And many people who've talked about the soul have used imagery of fire or water, which are things that are more like energy processes. For example, Eckhart's Fünkelein, the little spark, the scintilla animae, the soul spark, which comes from, corresponds to, and reaches out again to the divine. A potentiality, in other words, something in the process of happening, a latent function that needs to be nourished to grow and expand. Nowadays, it's not popular to say that there is a value to suffering, but it is part of the experience of suffering sometimes that it does deepen one's sense of what it means to be alive. A poet that I like very much, Henry Vaughan, well, he had a collection of poems, in fact, called The Silex Scintillans, which means the spark, the sparking flint, the flint from which the spark comes. It comes from the heart and is the spark that is involved in and nourished by suffering. Then I think of that phrase of Wordsworth after his brother was drowned in the Abergavenny, I think it was. A deep distress hath humanized my soul. And thinking of water, one would think of the Tao, the flow of life, which is not far from a kind of world soul, really, and the flow that is in Heraclitus, where everything is flow at the heart. I'm very fond of a number of films by Andrei Tarkovsky. One of them I'm thinking of is Solaris. If you think you've seen Solaris because you saw a terrible American film made in the 1990s, you haven't. You need to see the Russian film made in, I think, 1974, which is, I think, one of the most moving and philosophically fascinating films ever made. And it really shows somebody through the imagination of somebody that loves them and through their being imagined and through their experience of suffering actually growing a soul and coming to life. So there's a sort of resonance that brings this soul to life between the two characters, Chris and Hari, in that story. And I think that's a good image of how we grow a soul, if we do grow a soul, in this resonant area. But we need to have a sort of disposition, and perhaps that is the soul, a disposition that's both rapt and reflective and makes a living process possible, that opens a space. And here James Hillman, another disciple, if you like, of Jung, says, the soul is less an object of knowledge than it is a way of knowing the object, a way of knowing knowledge itself. So it's not really a thing, it's a disposition, a manner, an attitude, a way of being, and a process. It isn't contrary to the body, although when in the past it was conceived, one died, this soul was the thing that was left over, as it were. And I'm at the college at Oxford, of which I'm lucky enough to be a quondam fellow, is called All Souls. It's actually, its full name is All Souls of the Faithful Departed. But that is the idea of the soul as what's left of people once they've died. Of course, that is a very rich idea, and I'm not dismissing it. But it does rather lead to the idea that it's something separate from the body. Incidentally, those who don't like the college take great pleasure in pointing out that the French for All Souls College is Collège des Morts. But once again, Wittgenstein put his finger on it when he said the human body is the best picture of the human soul. And the soul is intangible, perhaps, but still embodied. And in every culture, images of breath, force, or motion in Greek, pneuma and psyche, ideas of breath, and the same ideas exist in Hebrew, the words, I believe, ruach and nefesh, which are words for soul, which are derived from the idea of breath. And without that, the soul becomes something rather nebulous. Without that embodied nature, it becomes terribly tenuous. And it reminds me of Hadrian's description of his soul as animula, vagula, blandula, that poor little wavering, vague, and sort of smooth little creature that slips away out of your mind. So it's important to remember that the soul is embodied, and it's deep also in instincts and intuitions, which is probably one of the ways whereby we contact it. And one shouldn't try to cut those out of the idea of the soul in order to make it noble. There was, in the Nazi era, as you know, great festivals of the burnings of books. And Freud's books were among those that were consigned to the flames. Those who threw the books into the fire were enjoined to chant the following words: in defiance of the soul-corroding glorification of instinctual life, and in the name of the nobility of the human soul, I commit to the flames the writings of Sigmund Freud. C.S. Peirce, an American 19th century philosopher who was also a logician and a mathematician and who I very much admire, wrote in an article which became a lecture and was beautifully entitled Detached Ideas on Vitally Important Topics. It is the instincts, the sentiments that make the substance of the soul. Cognition is only its surface, its locus of contact with what is external to it. The eyes are, we say, the windows of the soul. We see somebody's soul in their eyes, and in portraiture, too, there is a sense of contact with the soul. And we can't quite get away, can we, from this idea, I don't see why we should, because it's very deep in us, that something comes out of the eyes, not just goes into it. It's present in almost every culture and in every language. What I quite like is the Hasidic idea of soul, in which there are two distinct souls. They remind me somewhat of a couple of hemispheres I once described. One is the animal soul, which is all about self-preservation and self-enhancement, and the other is the divine soul, which is driven by the desire to reconnect with its source. And our lives are the story of the interplay of these two souls. They're not side by side, by the way, but they're sort of nested, so that the divine soul is inside the animal soul, which is inside the body. The soul is not the same as the body, but it's not opposed to it either. We need to go to people like Goethe and Blake to be able to understand that opposites don't have to eliminate one another. In particular, I like very much Goethe's idea that we find the infinite not by turning our backs on the finite, but through the finite. We find the general not by turning our backs on the particular, but through the particular, and that these are false dichotomies. In fact, in the Hasidic tradition, the nature of Sephirah, which is essentially the created world, is the synthesis of everything and its opposite. for if they didn't possess the power of synthesis, there would be no energy in anything. This is rather like the idea in Heraclitus of harmonia, two poles that are held in tension and out of which the richness of existence occurs. So somehow it's something there that is in the world but not in the world, that is in contact with something other but is also immanent here in the world. And I like that because the idea of creation is to create relationship. And so this otherness needs to be accessible. The divine needs to be both transcendent and immanent at the same time. I come back to that phrase in Iris Murdoch, a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is. The soul is what makes the world authentic. It's what is really in touch with experience. She also says it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. So it has that element of otherness, but it's brought together. And so it's indefinable but not remote. In Teilhard de Chardin's way of thinking, we might say we are steeped in soul. He has this wonderful expression, by means of all created things without exception, the divine assails us, penetrates us and molds us. We imagine it as distant and inaccessible, whereas in fact we live steeped in its burning layers. So how do we contact this thing that is other? Well, we need to make an effort. We need to put ourselves in the disposition to understand it. We're not going to understand it at all if we stand there resistant to the idea and waiting for it to sort of turn up as something credible to us. And I'm reminded here of a joke which a Jewish friend told me about a rabbi who's very poor but very spiritual. And his life would be very much more comfortable if he had some money. And he prays to God, please let me win the lottery. And his prayer never seems to be answered. One day he's at prayer, and God says to him, look, Samuel, meet me halfway, buy a ticket. And I sort of feel there's a deep spiritual truth in that we only get there if we are prepared to buy a ticket. As so often, we can say what it isn't. And Hillman, in a work called Suicide and the Soul, says the soul is a deliberately ambiguous concept, resisting all definition in the same manner as do all ultimate symbols, which provide the root metaphors for the systems of human thought. Mind, matter, nature, gravity, time, energy, and God all fall into this category. So spirituality is often about not knowing, because knowing means you've got it wrong. It can't be defined, it's not a concept, it's a symbol, not wholly of our making. Rabindranath Tagore talks about the ways in which one can understand. The small wisdom is like water in a glass, clear, transparent, pure. The great wisdom is like the water in the sea, dark, mysterious, impenetrable. So as Jung says, there may be a danger of wanting to understand the meaning, and by doing so, overvaluing the content, which is subjected to a sort of intellectual analysis and interpretation, so that the essentially symbolic character can no longer do its work. And what goes missing is meaning and value for the subject. So there's a sort of danger, in my terms, of the left hemisphere having to collapse too quickly into something familiar. What is it, precisely? Leaving, therefore, no place for the intuited and the implicit, through which all great ideas in art, in religion, and in our lives are communicated. Making things more explicit doesn't actually make them easier to understand. It means we understand something other than what it is that we're seeking to know. Sometimes things can speak very loud to us through rituals, through a mythos, which is not a fiction, but is just another kind of truth from logos that one arrives at by sequential reasoning. Metaphor is a way to deal with the apophatic. They say, he who knows doesn't tell, and he who tells doesn't know. So how are we to approach this? One is to take the idea of depth, which I've mentioned once or twice. Here is Berlin, Isaiah Berlin, on depth. The notion of depth is something with which philosophers seldom deal. Nevertheless, it is one of the most important categories we use. Although I attempt to describe what profundity consists in, as soon as I speak, it becomes quite clear that, no matter how long I speak, new chasms open. No matter what I say, I always have to leave 3 dots at the end. I'm forced to use language which is in principle, not only today, but forever inadequate for its purpose. You have no formula that will, by deduction, lead you to all the vistas opened by profound sayings. In this way, it is something like the sublime, except instead of the sublime without, it is the sublime within. And these two things surely correspond to one another, which is why we feel our soul, as we say, expands in a sublime landscape. The vastness of the view speaks to us internally. And sometimes we encounter this also in more mundane aspects, if you like, of life, or at least more familiar aspects of life, such as our life of love and through those that we love. In fact, in a secular age, one of the ways in which we can really understand that there is something beyond that we call the soul may be through eros, at its finest, at its greatest. Jung, again interpreted by Hillman, says that this is what makes meaning possible and deepens events into experience, and which is communicated in love. And there's a very nice piece of neuropsychological research recently by Fredrickson and Cole, which suggested people who are happy, or call themselves happy, but have little to no sense of meaning in their lives, have the same gene expression patterns as people who are enduring chronic adversity. In other words, they are stressed, although they report happiness. And it's people who have connections, betweennesses in their life that give it meaning, that report being satisfied. It's something deep, but it's also something very hard to bring into focus. It's that which grounds, but is itself unseen, like the eye. The eye sees, but we don't see the eye. It is the ground of our seeing. And attention, again, which makes the world what it is an aspect of consciousness, not a function of it. The spiritual is often in the places where we're not looking directly, but in the background, the in-between. Bonhoeffer calls it a kind of cantus firmus, using an idea from polyphonic music, the melody, as it were, to which all the other melodies provide the counterpoint. And he makes the point that if that element in our life, the spiritual, is kept going as the cantus firmus, we can depart as far as we like, away from that into the world, the actual world, the concrete world, the material, the fleshly, the emotional, the everyday, without losing something. I'm talking very much about the soul in general, but what about each of our individual souls? How do we square the idea of soul as something sort of generic and something particular? Well, it seems to me that the whole of creation is about the making of things particular out of things that are whole. And in the Goethean way, they're not necessarily opposed to one another. They may be aspects of one another. Individualization is part of creation, achieving an unfolding into complexity that is not in the world soul idea. We need both quanta and qualia. We need particles as well as waves. We need individuals as well as flow. And soul is that which seems to me not to be in any way opposed to material existence, but transcends it. It's not separate from the material in the way that a wave is not separate from the water. And yet the form, the force field, the thing that shapes it, the thing in which it's instantiated, is something concrete and not concrete at the same time. And I would see this as an aspect, really, if you asked me, my personal opinion, and that's all I can give, I would say there's something in the idea of panentheism, the idea that there is multiplicity and unity without denying either, and without delimiting the concept of the divine in the way that pantheism does. So to wrap up, a phrase of the American philosopher Eugene Gendlin: we think more than we can say. We feel more than we can think. We live more than we can feel. And there's much else besides. And perhaps the soul is what we mean when we reflect on that much else besides.
If the soul is to some extent dispositional, one's view of knowledge, one's view of what knowledge is for, what experience is, what it means, then that may be a sort of prerequisite for really understanding what the soul is.
Well, I'm only speaking, of course, inevitably from experience, but it seems to me that if the soul accords with anything, it accords with an attitude, a disposition, a certain kind of attention to the world. And it can be very much evoked by certain experiences with music, for example, for me, with the natural world, with love and friendship, and with things that I feel resonate with what that is. And what I tried to say was that none of the terms that we might be, liable to substitute for it really does the job.